Welcome. I am Daisy, your hostess. If you're new to my channel, I'm glad you found me. And to our subscribers, I want to take a minute and say thank you so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey, for your comments, your likes, your recommendations. This next book that I'm reading is a recommendation from one of our subscribers here. And I want to say thank you. Thank you. This book, probably you may be very familiar with the author, but the title is not one that many people associate with him, even though it's interesting as we're going to learn why this book was left on a shelf for 70 years before it was published. So it's called Outwitting the Devil by Napoleon Hill, better known for his very popular book, Think and Grow Rich. This particular book is annotated by Sharon Lechter, so throughout the reading you'll hear me say note, and those are her words that she has interspersed with throughout the reading here. And without any further delay, I'd like to go ahead and get started. So let's get started on this journey. Sit back and relax. A quote by Napoleon Hill. Fear is the tool of a man-made devil. Self-confident faith in one's self is both the man-made weapon which defeats this devil and the man-made tool which builds a triumphant life. And it is more than that. It is a link to the irresistible forces of the universe which stand behind a man who does not believe in failure and defeat as being anything but temporary experiences. End quote. Outwitting the Devil. Note to Readers by Sharon Lechter. Outwitting the Devil is the most profound book I have ever read. First, I was incredibly honored when Don Green, CEO of the Napoleon Hill Foundation, trusted me enough to ask me to become involved in this project. And then I read the manuscript. I couldn't sleep for a week. Written on a manual typewriter in 1938 by the master himself, Napoleon Hill. This manuscript had been locked away and hidden by Hill's family for 72 years. Why? Because they were frightened by the response it would invoke. Hill's courage in revealing the devil's work around each of us every day, in our churches, our schools, and our politics, threatened the very core of society as it was known at the time. When asked why the family had hidden the manuscript, Don Green recites the following inside story. It was the objections of Hill's wife, Annie Lou. She was secretary to Dr. William Plummer Jacobs, president of Presbyterian College in Clinton, South Carolina. Jacobs was also owner of Jacobs Press and a public counselor to a group of South Carolina textile firms. Jacobs hired Hill to come to Clinton to work for him, and Annie Lou did not want the book published because of the role of the devil. She feared the response from organized religion and maybe for Hill's job. Even though Hill died in 1970, Annie Lou did not die until 1984. Upon Annie Lou's death, the manuscript came into the possession of Dr. Charlie Johnson, then the president of the Napoleon Hill Foundation. Charlie was the nephew of Annie Lou Hill. Charlie's wife, Frankie, knew and shared Annie Lou's feelings. Frankie told Charlie that she did not want the article published while she was alive either. Charlie's wife passed away a couple of years ago, and Charlie finally gave me the manuscript, bound in red leather and embossed with the letters Outwitting the Devil in gold on the cover. The Foundation believes the manuscript has a powerful message that needs to be shared. After speaking with Don, I was overcome with a powerful realization this book, even though written in 1938, was actually meant to be published today, meant to rock our society today. It was intended to provide answers during this uncertain economic and spiritual time. It provides the keys for each of us to outwit the devil in our own lives. It shows us how to chart a course for success and to add value to the world around us through the process. Just as Think and Grow Rich helped us recover and succeed after the Great Depression, Outwitting the Devil was written to help each of us recover and succeed today. You may ask if Hill believes his conversation with the devil was real, or was it merely imaginary? The choice is yours. But I also asked Don Green about Hill's thoughts in his other writings to see if we could get another look inside Hill's head. Don's response was as follows. The use of imaginary conversations was not new to Hill. In 1953, Hill published How to Raise Your Own Salary, which was written as a conversation between Hill and Carnegie. Hill had actually interviewed Carnegie in 1908, and Carnegie died in 1919, well before its publication. This was not the first time Hill used imaginary meetings to convey what he was writing about. In Think and Grow Rich, Hill, writing about the sixth sense, wrote about his imaginary council meeting with the 9 men whose life works had been the most impressive to Hill. These 9 imaginary council members were Emerson, Paine, Edison, Darwin, Lincoln, Burbank, Napoleon, Ford, and Carnegie. Hill wrote in Think and Grow Rich that during his meetings with his invisible counselors, he found his mind most receptive to ideas, thoughts, and knowledge that had reached him during these times when his sixth sense was activated. Outwitting the Devil was by no means his first time to write about religion. In fact, after he published Law of Success in 1928, he received letters of criticism about his stance on schools and religion. In Think and Grow Rich, in the chapter titled The 6 Ghosts of Fear, Hill wrote that fear of death, in the majority of cases, could be charged to religious fanaticism. Hill had much to say about religious leaders in this section of his classic bestseller. Hill had much to say about religion even in Hill's Golden Rule magazine. He wrote an article, a suggestion to ministers of the gospel, in which he admonished church leaders to teach their followers to practice harmony among each other. So the choice is yours. Did Hill actually talk to the devil? Or is this a parable created to reach and touch your heart? Hill's unique style will pull you in and move you in ways you never thought possible. The words in this book are Hill's own. Since the original manuscript was quite lengthy, I edited with careful precision to preserve the profound impact of his passage. I have kept his original language in place even when modern grammar may have dictated adjustments. In an effort to highlight certain issues, bring clarity to his words, and show how his predictions have become realities, I have added my thoughts throughout the manuscript in a different type style. This allows you to choose to read the book either with my comments or without. Please enjoy this powerful book and share it with your friends and family. The power in Hill's words can and will change your life. And a note to the readers. Foreword. Dr. Napoleon Hill is arguably the most famous self-help action writer, thinker, evocateur, and best-selling author of all time. We ask that you refer quickly to the actual interview with the devil. You will thus get the impact in your life of who the devil really is and what he does to 98% of living beings, according to the devil himself. As a thought stimulator, Hill quickly starts the book's journey, taking us through his life and what was meaningful and life-changing to him. Hill learned the greatest and most useful and instantly helpful success principles on the planet, but he did not know how to use and easily apply them. We predict that this is true for many people still today. It is easy to say the words and sometimes even think the thoughts. It takes a profound and lasting decision to actually live by the principles daily in every way. Sharon Lechter illuminates what Hill's words mean when transported in today's dollars, thinking, and understanding. Dr. Hill's goal was to communicate clearly a philosophy and practice of individual achievement that would stimulate lasting happiness. His inner knower guided him to find his own life's rainbow. You are being tested now in the toughest times imaginable. just as Hill was during the Depression. He felt, acted, and became depressed and despondent, an attitude that was deleterious to his very beingness, just as it is to you and your wellness. Reading this inspiring book can help you snap out of your lethargy and negative mindedness and get you on a new and more glorious path to an ever higher, better, and more rewarding future. Like Hill, you are here to master your fears and not let them master you, to live passionately and with purpose, to decide what you want to be, do, and have, and to make it so. As you rediscover the marvelous and magical discoveries of Dr. Hill, you will know and believe that you can match them and surpass them if you want to, because you are unlimited. Hill correctly says, your only limitations are self-imposed. This book will help you be aware that you can achieve your breakthroughs using all that he learned by interviewing the 500 greatest living achievers. You will discover whether the devil he interviews is real or imaginary, much like the devil that you may personally be dealing with in your life and experience. Signed, Mark Victor Hansen, who is the co-creator of the #1 New York Times bestseller series Chicken Soup for the Soul and co-author of Cracking the Millionaire Code, The 1 Minute Millionaire, and Cash in a Flash. Chapter 1. My first meeting with Andrew Carnegie. For more than a quarter of a century, my major purpose has been that of isolating and organizing into a philosophy of achievement the causes of both failure and success, with the object of being helpful to others who have neither the inclination nor the opportunity to engage in this form of research. My labor began in 1908 as the result of an interview that I had with the late Andrew Carnegie. I frankly told Mr. Carnegie that I wished to enter law school and that I had conceived the idea of paying my way through school by interviewing successful men and women, finding out how they came by their success, and writing stories of my discoveries for magazines. At the end of our visit, Mr. Carnegie asked whether or not I possessed enough courage to carry out a suggestion he wished to offer me. I replied that courage was about all I had, and that I was prepared to do my best to carry out any suggestion he cared to offer. He then said, "Your idea of writing stories about men and women who are successful is commendable, as far as it goes, and I have no intention of trying to discourage you from carrying out your purpose. But I must tell you that if you wish to be of enduring service, not only to those now living, but to posterity as well, you can do so if you will take the time to organize all of the causes of failure as well as the causes of success. There are millions of people in the world who have not the slightest conception of the causes of success and failure. The schools and colleges teach practically everything except the principles of individual achievement. They require young men and women to spend from 4 to 8 years acquiring abstract knowledge, but do not teach them what to do with this knowledge after they get it. The world is in need of a practical, understandable philosophy of achievement, organized from the factual knowledge gained from the experience of men and women in the great university of life. In the entire field of philosophy, I find nothing which even remotely resembles the sort of philosophy which I have in mind. We have few philosophers who are capable of teaching men and women the art of living. It seems to me that here is an opportunity which should challenge an ambitious young man of your type. But ambition alone is not enough for this task which I have suggested. The one who undertakes it must have the courage and tenacity. The job will require at least 20 years of continuous effort, during which the one who undertakes it will have to earn his living from some other source, because this sort of research is never profitable at the outset, and generally those who have contributed to civilization through work of this nature have had to wait 100 years or so after their own funerals to receive recognition for their labor. Note to readers: Sharon Lechter adds her comments in special sections like this. Note: 20 years of labor with no pay and possible no recognition? How would you respond to this offer? As he discusses below, Hill accepted Carnegie's challenge and, with a letter of introduction from Carnegie, set about interviewing the giants of that time, including Theodore Roosevelt, Thomas Edison, John D. Rockefeller, Henry Ford, Alexander Graham Bell, King Gillette, founder of the Gillette Safety Razor Company, and many others. His effort ultimately culminated in the publication of several books, including the 8-volume Law of Success and Think and Grow Rich. After more than 25 years of research, Think and Grow Rich is widely recognized as the seminal work in self-development, introducing essentially all the principles that continue to serve as the foundation for the teachings of the personal development gurus of today. As reflected in Hill's own description, the process of developing and publishing Think and Grow Rich was itself a study in the principles he revealed. It may be telling that the manuscript of Outwitting the Devil was written the year after Think and Grow Rich was published, since this work may reveal the frustration and revelation of Hill's other self and how he conquered his frustrations and succeeded in using the very principles he described in Think and Grow Rich. Outwitting the Devil will reveal Hill's spiritual awakening and how each of us can learn from his encounter with the devil. End note. If you undertake this job, you should interview not only the few who have succeeded, but the many who have failed. You should carefully analyze many thousands of people who have been classified as failures, and I mean by the term failures, men and women who come to the closing chapter of life disappointed because they did not attain the goal which they had set their hearts upon achieving. As inconsistent as it may seem, you will learn more about how to succeed from failures than you will from the so-called successes. They will teach you what not to do. Along toward the end of your labor, if you carry it through successfully, you will make a discovery which may be a great surprise to you. You will discover that the cause of success is not something separate and apart from the man, that it is a force so intangible in nature that the majority of men never recognize it, a force which might be properly called the other self. Noteworthy is the fact that this other self seldom exerts its influence or makes itself known excepting at times of unusual emergency, when men are forced, through adversity and temporary defeat, to change their habits and to think their way out of difficulty. My experience has taught me that a man is never quite so near success as when that which he calls failure has overtaken him, for it is on occasions of this sort that he is forced to think. If he thinks accurately and with persistence, he discovers that so-called failure usually is nothing more than a signal to rearm himself with a new plan or purpose. Most real failures are due to limitations which men set up in their own minds. If they had the courage to go one step further, they would discover their error. Note: most real failures are due to limitations which men set up in their own minds. A negative mindset and self-doubt can be the primary obstacle to success. With the current economic downturn, far too many people who have all their life done everything right are now, for the first time, facing severe economic adversity. The greatest barrier to their recovery is their own fear and self-doubt instilled by their recent experience. Have you allowed the current economic downturn to overtake you? Have self-doubt and self-sabotage held you back from reaching your dreams? Are you your own worst enemy? In Think and Grow Rich, Hill told the story of R.U. Darby, a gold prospector. Frustrated when a rich vein of gold apparently ran out, Darby sold his gold claim for a pittance to the town junkman. The junkman brought in the right expert advisors and found that Darby would have rediscovered the vein had he moved his digging by a mere 3 feet. Had Darby persevered, he would have made his fortune, but he gave up and abandoned his dreams when he was only 3 feet from gold. Rather than being crushed by his error, Darby learned from his experience and went on to build an insurance empire. Will you abandon your quest just before reaching great success when you're only 3 feet from gold? You can read how many of today's icons persevered through difficulty situations in the book, 3 Feet from Gold. Begin life anew. Mr. Carnegie's speech reshaped my entire life and planted in my mind a burning purpose which has driven me ceaselessly, and this despite the fact that I had but a vague idea as to what he meant by the term other self. During my labor of research into the causes of failure and success, I have had the privilege of analyzing more than 25,000 men and women who were rated as failures and over 500 who were classed as successful. Many years ago, I caught my first glimpse of that other self Mr. Carnegie had mentioned. The discovery came, as he said it would, as the result of 2 major turning points of my life, which constituted emergencies that forced me to think my way out of difficulties such as I had never before experienced. I wish it were possible to describe this discovery without the use of the personal pronoun, but this is impossible because it came through personal experiences from which it cannot be separated. To give you the complete picture, I shall have to go back to the first of these 2 major turning points and bring you up to the discovery step by step. The research necessary for the accumulation of the data from which the 17 principles of achievement and the 30 major causes of failure were organized required years of labor. I had reached the false conclusion that my task of organizing a complete philosophy of personal achievement had been completed. My work had merely begun. I had erected the skeleton of a philosophy by organizing the 17 principles of achievement and the 30 major causes of failure. But that skeleton had to be covered with the flesh of application and experience. Moreover, it had to be given a soul through which it might inspire men and women to meet obstacles without going down under them. The soul, which had yet to be added, as I discovered later, became available only after my other self made its appearance, through 2 major turning points of my life. Resolving to turn my attention and whatever talents I might possess into monetary returns through business and professional channels, I decided to go into the profession of advertising. And I became the advertising manager of the LaSalle Extension University of Chicago. Everything went along beautifully for 1 year, at the end of which I was seized by a violent dislike for my job and resigned. I then entered the chain store business with the former president of LaSalle Extension University and became the president of the Betsy Ross Candy Company. Unfortunate, or what seemed to me at the time to be unfortunate, disagreements with business associates disengaged me from that undertaking. The lure of advertising still was in my blood, and I tried again to give expression to it by organizing a school of advertising and salesmanship as a part of Bryant and Stratton Business College. The enterprise was sailing smoothly, and we were making money rapidly when the United States entered World War I. In response to an inner urge which no words can describe, I walked away from the school and entered the service of the United States government under President Woodrow Wilson's personal direction, leaving a perfectly sound business to disintegrate. On Armistice Day 1918, I began the publication of the Golden Rule magazine, despite the fact that I did not have a penny of capital, and the magazine grew rapidly and soon gained a nationwide circulation of nearly 500,000, ending its first year's business with a profit of $3,156. Note: for a proper perspective, $3,156 in 1918 would represent $45,000 today based on the Consumer Price Index average of each year compiled by United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, and $202,000 using the nominal GDP per capita tables. Not a bad profit for a first year in the magazine business, when 80 to 90% of new titles fail and even the successful ones take 3 to 5 years to become profitable. Reference link www.magazinepublisher.com/startup.html. End note. Some years later, I learned from an experienced publisher that no man experienced in the publication and distribution of national magazines would think of starting such a magazine with less than $500,000 of capital. The Golden Rule magazine and I were destined to part company. The more we succeeded, the more discontented I became, until finally, due to an accumulation of petty annoyances caused by business associates, I made them a present of the magazine and stepped out. Through that move, perhaps, I tossed a small fortune over my shoulder. Note, this was only the beginning of Hill's love for magazines. The Golden Rule was followed by his publication of the Napoleon Hill magazine. Later in life, he became the editor of Success, a magazine that is still published today. End note. Next, I organized a training school for salesmen. My first assignment was to train a sales army of 3,000 people for a chain store company, for which I received $10 for each salesman who went through my classes. Within 6 months, my work had netted me a little over $30,000. Success as far as money was concerned was crowning my efforts with abundance. Again, I became fidgety inside. I was not happy. It became more obvious every day that no amount of money would ever make me happy. Without the slightest reasonable excuse for my actions, I stepped out and gave up a business from which I might easily have earned a healthy salary. My friends and business associates thought I was crazy, and they were not backward about saying so. Frankly, I was inclined to agree with them, but there seemed nothing I could do about it. I was seeking happiness, and I had not found it. At least that is the only explanation I could offer for my unusual actions. What man really knows himself? Note, again, I became fidgety inside. I was not happy. It became more obvious every day that no amount of money would ever make me happy. I could have written this about myself a few years ago, but when I took action by leaving a situation that, although financially rewarding, was no longer aligned with my personal mission, new doors of opportunity opened for me. It turned out to be the best decision of my professional life. Can you think of a time in your life when you made a difficult decision, but knew it was the right one, even when others questioned you? End note. That was during the late fall of 1923. I found myself stranded in Columbus, Ohio, without funds, and worse still, without a plan by which to work my way out of my difficulty. It was the first time in my life that I had actually been stranded because of lack of funds. Many times previously I had found money to be rather shy, but never before had I failed to get what I needed for my personal conveniences. The experience stunned me. I seemed totally at sea to what I could do or should do. I thought of a dozen plans by which I might solve my problem, but dismissed them all as being either impractical or impossible of achievement. I felt like one who was lost in a jungle without a compass. Every attempt I made to work my way out brought me back to the original starting point. For nearly 2 months I suffered with the worst of all human ailments, indecision. I knew the 17 principles of personal achievement, but what I did not know was how to apply them. Without knowing it, I was facing one of those emergencies of life through which Mr. Carnegie had told me men sometimes discover their other selves. My distress was so great that it never occurred to me to sit down and analyze its cause and seek its cure. Note, the worst of all human ailments, indecision. Have you ever felt paralyzed by indecision? This was the first major turning point in Napoleon Hill's life. His moving from job to job, seeking contentment, and his own ideal professional life sounds like many people today, people who are seeking contentment in their jobs and lives. Hill's predicament was, by his own admission, self-inflicted. However, he found himself in very much the same circumstances as someone today who has been negatively affected by the present economic situation. Hill took advantage of his temporary defeat, using it as a spur to force himself into thought and analysis to find his other self. If you have been dealt a blow by economic circumstances, you too can use it as a lever and motivation to find your other self. End note. Defeat is converted into victory. One afternoon, I reached a decision through which I found the way out of my difficulty. I had a feeling that I wanted to get out into the open spaces of the country, where I could get a breath of fresh air and think. I began to walk and had gone 7 or 8 miles when I felt myself brought suddenly to a standstill. For several minutes I stood there as if I had been glued to my tracks. Everything around me went dark. I could hear the loud sound of some form of energy which was vibrating at a very high rate. Then my nerves became quiet, my muscles relaxed, and a great calmness came over me. The atmosphere began to clear, and as it did so, I received a command from within which came in the form of a thought, as near as I can describe it. The command was so clear and distinct that I could not misunderstand it. In substance, it said, "The time has come for you to complete the philosophy of achievement which you began at Carnegie's suggestion. Go back home at once and begin transferring the data you have gathered from your own mind to written manuscripts." My other self had awakened. For a few minutes I was frightened. The experience was unlike any I had ever undergone before. I turned and walked rapidly until I reached home. As I approached the house, I saw my 3 little boys looking out of a window of our house at our neighbor's children, who were dressing a Christmas tree in the house next door. Then I recalled that it was Christmas Eve. Moreover, I recalled, with a feeling of deep distress such as I had never known before, that there would be no Christmas tree at our house. The look of disappointment on the faces of my children reminded me painfully of that fact. I went into the house, sat down on my typewriter, and began at once to reduce to writing the discoveries I had made concerning the causes of success and failure. As I placed that first sheet of paper in the typewriter, I was interrupted by that same strange feeling which had come over me out in the country a few hours before, and this thought flashed into my mind. Your mission in life is to complete the world's first philosophy of individual achievement. You have been trying in vain to escape your task, each effort having brought you failure. You are seeking happiness. Learn this lesson once and forever, that you will find happiness only by helping others to find it. You have been a stubborn student. You had to be cured of your stubbornness through disappointment. Within a few years from now, the whole world will start through an experience which will place millions of people in need of the philosophy which you have been directed to complete. Your big opportunity to find happiness by rendering useful service will have come. Go to work, and do not stop until you have completed and published the manuscripts which you have begun. I was conscious of having arrived at last at the end of life's rainbow, and I was happy. Doubt makes its appearance. The spell, if the experience may be so called, passed away. I began to write. Shortly thereafter, my reason suggested to me that I was embarking upon a fool's mission. The idea of a man who was down and almost out presuming to write a philosophy of personal achievement seemed so ludicrous that I laughed hilariously, perhaps scornfully. I squirmed in my chair, ran my fingers through my hair, and tried to create an alibi that would justify me in my own mind in taking the sheet of paper out of my typewriter before I had really begun to write. But the urge to continue was stronger than the desire to quit. I became reconciled to my task and went ahead. Note: the urge to continue was stronger than the desire to quit. Remember that time when you wanted to quit, but something drove you to keep going? It might have been your other self. End note. Looking backward now, in the light of all that has happened, I can see that those minor experiences of adversity through which I had passed were among the most fortunate and profitable of all my experiences. They were blessings in disguise because they forced me to continue a work which finally brought me an opportunity to make myself more useful to the world than I might have been had I succeeded in any previous plan or purpose. For almost 3 months I worked on those manuscripts, completing them during the early part of 1924. As soon as they had been completed, I felt myself again being lured by the desire to get back into the great American game of business. Succumbing to the lure, I purchased the Metropolitan Business College in Cleveland, Ohio, and began to lay plans for increasing its capacity. By the end of 1924, we had developed and expanded by adding new courses until we were doing a business nearly double the best previous record the school had ever known. Again, the germ of discontentment began to make itself felt in my blood. Again, I knew that I could not find happiness in this sort of endeavor. I turned the business over to my associates and went on the lecture platform, lecturing on the philosophy of achievement, to the organization of which I had devoted so many of my previous years. One night I was booked to lecture in Canton, Ohio. Fate, or whatever it is that seems sometimes to shape the destiny of men, no matter how hard they may try to battle against it, again stepped into the picture and brought me face to face with a painful experience. In my Canton audience sat Don Ermele, publisher of the Canton Daily News. Mr. Mellett became so thoroughly interested in the philosophy of individual achievement on which I lectured that night that he invited me to come to see him the following day. That visit resulted in partnership agreement, which was to have taken place on the 1st of the following January, when Mr. Mellett planned to resign as publisher of the Daily News, to take charge of the business and publishing of the philosophy on which I had been working. However, in July 1926, Mr. Mellett was murdered by Pat McDermott, an underworld character, and a Canton, Ohio policeman, both of whom were sentenced to life imprisonment. He was murdered because he was exposing in his newspaper a hookup between the bootleggers and certain members of the Canton police force. The crime was one of the most shocking that the Prohibition era produced. Note: the July 1926 murder of crusading journalist Donald Ring Mellett, the editor of the Canton, Ohio Daily News, was one of the most publicized crimes in the 1920s. In 1925, Mellett had discovered widespread corruption within the Canton police force and embarked on an anti-vice, anti-corruption editorial campaign targeting, among others, the Canton police chief. Hill was reported to have asked Ohio's governor to initiate an investigation of the corruption, a detail not reflected in Hill's account. Local underworld figures and at least one Canton police officer hired Patrick McDermott, an ex-con from Pennsylvania, to silence Mellett. Mellett was gunned down outside his home. As the story goes, gunmen were also lying in wait for Hill, but a fortuitous automotive breakdown kept him out of their way. On July 17, the New York Times reported in an article titled "More Death Threats Follow the Slaying of Canton Editor" that the citizens of Canton are terror-stricken by threats of further killings by the rulers of the gamblers, bootleggers, and other criminals. As recounted by Hill, after hearing of Mellett's murder and receiving an anonymous warning to get out of town, he fled to West Virginia. In large part due to the work of a private detective hired by the Stark County prosecutor, McDermott, 2 local gangsters, and a former police detective were ultimately convicted of Mellett's murder. End note. Chance saves my life. The morning after Mr. Mellett's death, I was called on the telephone and put on notice by some unknown person that I had 1 hour in which to get out of Canton, that I could go voluntarily within the hour, but if I waited longer, I probably would go in a pine box. My business association with Mr. Mellett had apparently been misunderstood. His murderers evidently believed I was directly connected with the expose he was making in his newspapers. I did not wait for the 1 hour time limit to expire, but immediately got into my automobile and drove down to the home of relatives in the mountains of West Virginia, where I remained until the murderers had been placed in jail. That experience came well within the category described by Mr. Carnegie as an emergency that forces men to think. For the first time in my life, I knew the pain of constant fear. My experience a few years before in Columbus had filled my mind with doubt and temporary indecision, but this one had filled it with a fear which I seemed unable to remove. During the time that I was in hiding, I seldom left the house at night, and when I did step out, I kept my hand on an automatic pistol in my coat pocket with the safety catch unlatched for immediate action. If a strange automobile stopped in front of the house where I was hiding, I went into the basement and carefully scrutinized its occupants through the basement windows. After some months of this sort of experience, my nerves began to crack. My courage had completely left me. The ambition which had heartened me during the long years of labor in my search for the causes of failure and success also had departed. Slowly, step by step, I felt myself slipping into a state of lethargy from which I was afraid I should never be able to emerge. The feeling must have been closely akin to that experienced by one who suddenly steps into quicksand and realizes that every effort to extricate himself carries him just so much deeper. Fear is a self-generating morass. If the seed of insanity had been in my makeup, surely it would have germinated during those months of living death. Foolish indecision, irresolute dreams, doubt, and fear were my mind's concern day and night. The emergency I faced was disastrous in two ways. First, the very nature of it kept me in a constant state of indecision and fear. Secondly, the forced concealment kept me in idleness, with its attendant heaviness of time, which I naturally devoted to worry. My reasoning faculty had almost been paralyzed. I realized that I had to work myself out of this state of mind. But how? The resourcefulness which had helped me to meet all previous emergencies seemed to have completely taken wing, leaving me helpless. Out of my difficulties, which were burdensome enough up to this point, grew another which seemed more painful than all the others combined. It was the realization that I had spent the better portion of my past years in chasing a rainbow, searching hither and yon for the causes of success, and finding myself now more helpless than any of the 25,000 people whom I had judged as being failures. This thought was almost maddening. Moreover, it was extremely humiliating, because I had been lecturing all over the country in schools and colleges and before business organizations, presuming to tell other people how to apply the 17 principles of success, while here I was, unable to apply them myself. I was sure that I never could again face the world with a feeling of confidence. Every time I looked at myself in a mirror, I noticed an expression of self-contempt on my face. And not infrequently, I did say things to the man in the mirror which are not printable. I had begun to place myself in the category of charlatans who offer others a remedy for failure which they themselves cannot successfully apply. The criminals who had murdered Mr. Mellett had been tried and sent to the penitentiary for life. Therefore, it was perfectly safe, as far as they were concerned, for me to come out of hiding and again take up my work. I could not come out, however, because now I faced circumstances more frightful than the criminals who had sent me into hiding. The experience had destroyed whatever initiative I had possessed. I felt myself in the clutches of some depressing influence which seemed like a nightmare. I was alive, I could move around, but I could not think of a single move by which I might continue to seek the goal which I had, at Mr. Carnegie's suggestion, set for myself. I was rapidly becoming indifferent, not only toward myself, but worse still. I was becoming grouchy and irritable toward those who had given me shelter during my emergency. I faced the greatest emergency of my life. Unless you have gone through a similar experience, you cannot possibly know how I felt. Such experiences cannot be described. To be understood, they must be felt. Note: my reasoning faculty had almost been paralyzed. Hill was paralyzed first by fear of physical harm and then by the shame of having been paralyzed by that fear. Have you ever been paralyzed by similar emotions? When you're faced with your own emergency, fear can either motivate you or paralyze you. By recognizing that you have a choice and reacting positively to your fears, you can permanently change your life for the better. Many people today may be experiencing the same feelings of anger, followed by irritability and the debilitating feeling of indifference. They feel discouraged and lack of confidence due to uncertainty in their financial situation or personal lives. They may be angry and allow that anger to paralyze them. I had a conversation with just such a young man. "I am 30 years old," he said, "and have no marketable skills or prospects." He had a million excuses for not acting to change his situation. I pointed out that unless he took action, nothing would change. Unless you make an effort to change things, I said, in a year's time the only difference will be that you're 31 years old with no marketable skills or prospects. Does this pattern sound familiar to you, either for yourself or someone you care for? How do you break that paralysis? Napoleon Hill now shares how he overcame his fear and indifference and found the hope, inspiration, and motivation to recover and create success in his life. End note. The most dramatic moment of my life. The turn came suddenly in fall 1927, more than a year after the Canton incident. I left the house one night and walked up to the public school building on top of a hill above the town. I had reached a decision to fight the matter out with myself before the night ended. I began to walk around the building, trying to force my befuddled brain to think clearly. I must have made several hundred trips around the building before anything which even remotely resembled organized thought began to take place in my mind. As I walked, I repeated over and over to myself, "There is a way out, and I'm going to find it before I go back to the house." I must have repeated that sentence 1,000 times. Moreover, I meant exactly what I was saying. I was thoroughly disgusted with myself, but I entertained a hope of salvation. Then, like a flash of lightning out of a clear sky, an idea burst into my mind with such force that the impulse drove my blood up and down my veins. "This is your testing time. You have been reduced to poverty and humiliated in order that you might be forced to discover your other self." Note: if today's economic times have dealt you a blow, moving you toward poverty, embarrassing you, or damaging your self-confidence, consider it as a test, just as Napoleon Hill did in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Force yourself to discover your other self. By working through the low points in your life and persevering, you can gain the insight needed to succeed. For the first time in years, I recalled what Carnegie had said about this other self. I recalled now that he said I would discover it toward the end of my labor of research into the causes of failure and success, and that the discovery usually came as the result of an emergency, when men are forced to change their habits and to think their way out of difficulty. I continued to walk around the schoolhouse, but now I was walking on air. Subconsciously, I seemed to know that I was about to be released from the self-made prison into which I had cast myself. I realized that this great emergency had brought me an opportunity, not merely to discover my other self, but to test the soundness of the philosophy of achievement which I had been teaching others as being workable. Soon I would know whether it would work or not. I made up my mind that if it did not work, I would burn the manuscripts I had written and never again be guilty of telling other people that they were the masters of their fate, the captains of their souls. Note: Hill is paraphrasing from the poem Invictus, published in 1888 by William Ernest Henley, 1849-1903. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody, but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. End of note. The full moon was just rising over the mountaintop. I had never seen it shine so brightly before. As I stood gazing at it, another thought flashed into my mind. It was this: you have been telling other people how to master fear and how to surmount the difficulties which arise out of the emergencies of life. From now on, you can speak with authority, because you are about to rise above your own difficulties with courage and purpose, resolute and unafraid. With that thought came a change in the chemistry of my being, which lifted me into a state of exaltation I had never before known. My brain began to clear itself of the state of lethargy into which it had lapsed. My faculty of reason began to work once more. For a brief moment I was happy to have had the privilege of going through those long months of torment, because the experience provided an opportunity for me to test the soundness of the principles of achievement, which I had so laboriously wrested from my research. When this thought came to me, I stopped still, drew my feet closely together, saluted, I did not know what or whom, and stood rigidly at attention for several minutes. This seemed, at first, like a foolish thing to do, but while I was standing there, another thought came through in the form of an order that was as brief and snappy as any ever given by a military commander to a subordinate. The order said, "Tomorrow, get into your automobile and drive to Philadelphia, where you will receive aid in publishing your philosophy of achievement." There was no further explanation and no modification of the order. As soon as I received it, I walked back to the house, went to bed, and slept with peace of mind such as I had not known for over a year. When I awoke the following morning, I got out of bed and immediately began to pack my clothes and make ready for the trip to Philadelphia. My reason told me that I was embarking upon a fool's mission. Who did I know in Philadelphia to whom I might apply for financial aid in publishing 8 volumes of books at a cost of $25,000? I asked myself. Instantly the answer to that question flashed into my mind as plainly as if it had been uttered in audible words. You are following orders now. Instead of asking questions, your other self will be in charge during this trip. There was another condition which seemed to make my preparation to go to Philadelphia absurd. I had no money. This thought had barely occurred to me when my other self exploded it by giving another sharp order saying, "Ask your brother-in-law for $50 and he will lend it to you." The order seemed definite and final. Without further hesitation, I followed instructions. When I asked my brother-in-law for the money, he said, "Why, certainly, you can have $50, but if you're going to be gone very long, you had better take $100. I thanked him, and I said I thought $50 would be enough. I knew it was not enough, but that was the amount my other self had commanded me to ask for, and that is the amount I secured. I was greatly relieved when I found that my brother-in-law was not going to ask me why I was going to Philadelphia. If he had known all that had taken place in my mind during the previous night, he perhaps would have thought I should go to a psychiatric hospital for treatment instead of going to Philadelphia on a wild goose chase. My other self takes command. I left with my head telling me I was a fool, and my other self commanding me to ignore the challenge and carry out my instructions. I drove all night, arriving in Philadelphia the next morning. My first thought was to look up a modestly priced boarding house where I could rent a room for about $1 a day. Here again, my other self took charge and gave me the command to register at the most exclusive hotel in the city. With a little more than $40 of my remaining capital in my pocket, it seemed like financial suicide when I marched up to the desk and asked for a room. Or rather, I should say I started to ask for a room when my newly discovered other self gave the order to ask for a suite of rooms, the cost of which would about consume my remaining capital in 2 days. I obeyed. The bellboy picked up my bags, handed me my claim, check for my automobile, and bowed me toward the elevator as if I were the Prince of Wales. It was the first time in more than a year that any human being had shown me such deference. My own relatives, with whom I had been living, far from having shown me deference, and so I imagined, felt I was a burden on their hands, and I'm sure that I was, because no man in the frame of mind that I had been in for the past year could be anything other than a burden to all with whom he came into contact. It was becoming apparent that my other self was determined to wean me away from the inferiority complex which I had developed. I tossed the bellboy $1. I started to estimate what my hotel bill would be by the end of the week when my other self commanded me to get my mind entirely off of all thoughts of limitation and to conduct myself, for the time being, just as I would if I had all the money I wanted in my pockets. The experience I was passing through was both new and strange to me. I had never posed as being anything other than what I believed myself to be. For nearly half an hour, this other self gave orders which I followed to the letter during the subsequent period of my stay in Philadelphia. The instructions were given through the medium of thoughts, which presented themselves in my mind with such force that they were readily distinguishable from my ordinary self-created thoughts. Note: Hill took on the persona of the wealthy man he wanted to be. We strongly agree that to be wealthy, you need to think wealthy. It is also important to be in the right environment. Don Green, CEO of the Napoleon Hill Foundation, once told me, "I first bought my good suits from Sobel's, a custom clothing store where Eastman Kodak executives shopped. The owner had a sign behind the register that said, 'If you want to be a success, you must first dress the part.' However, we recommend moderation in trying to emulate Mr. Hill in spending money that he did not have." End note. I received strange orders from a strange source. My instructions began in this fashion. You are now completely in charge of your other self. You are entitled to know that two entities occupy your body, as in fact two similar entities occupy the body of each living person on earth. One of these entities is motivated by and responds to the impulse of fear. The other is motivated by and responds to the impulse of faith. For more than a year, you have been driven like a slave by the fear entity. Night before last, the faith entity gained control over your physical body, and you are now motivated by that entity. For the sake of convenience, you may call this faith entity your other self. It knows no limitations, has no fears, and recognizes no such word as impossible. You were directed to select this environment of luxury in a good hotel as a means of discouraging the return to power of the fear entity. That fear-motivated old self is not dead. It has merely been dethroned, and it will follow you around wherever you go, awaiting a favorable opportunity to step in and take charge of you again. It can gain control of you only through your thoughts. Remember this, and keep the doors to your mind tightly closed against all thoughts which seek to limit you in any manner whatsoever, and you will be safe. Do not permit yourself to worry about the money you will need for your immediate expenses. That will come to you by the time you must have it. Now, let us get down to business. First of all, you should know that the faith entity now in charge of your body performs no miracles, nor does it work in opposition to any of nature's laws. As long as it is in charge of your body, it will guide you when you call on it, through impulses of thought which it will place in your mind, in carrying out your plans through the most logical and convenient natural media available. Above everything else, get this fact clearly fixed in your mind, that your other self will not do your work for you. It will only guide you intelligently in achieving for yourself the objects of your desires. Note, will you be guided by faith, or will you allow fear to overtake you? End note. This other self will aid you in translating your plans into reality. Moreover, you should know that it begins always with your major or most pronounced desire. At this time, your major desire, the one which brought you here, is to publish and distribute the results of your research into the causes of success and failure. You estimate that you will need approximately $25,000. Among your acquaintances, there's a man who will supply you with this needed capital. Begin at once to call into your mind the names of all persons of your acquaintance whom you have reason to believe might be induced to furnish the financial aid you require. When the name of the logical person comes into your mind, you will recognize it immediately. Communicate with that person and the aid you seek will begin. In your approach, however, present your requests in terminology such as you would use in the usual course of business transactions. Make no reference whatsoever to this introduction you have had to your other self. If you violate these instructions, you will meet with temporary defeat. Your other self will remain in charge and continue to direct you as long as you rely upon it. Keep doubt and fear and worry and all thoughts of limitation entirely out of your mind. That will be all for the present. You will now begin to move of your own free will, precisely as you did before you discovered your other self. Physically, you are the same as you have always been. Therefore, no one will recognize that any change has taken place in you. I looked around the room, blinked my eyes, and to make sure that I was not dreaming, I got up and walked over to a mirror and looked at myself closely. The expression on my face had changed from one of doubt to one of courage and faith. There was no longer any doubt in my mind that my physical body was in charge of an influence far different from the one which had been dethroned 2 nights before, as I walked around the schoolhouse in West Virginia. Note: here, in editing the manuscript, I have ended the chapter at one of the great turning points in the author's life. Have you ever undergone a life change such as the one Hill describes above? It can also be described in religious terms as a conversion experience. Others may simply refer to it as a wake-up call or a tap on the shoulder, or more vehemently, as a slap in the face. End of chapter. Let's head over to the next video, where we continue with the reading of Outwitting the Devil by Napoleon Hill, annotated by Sharon Lechter. As we get into chapter 2, a new world is revealed. Please do take a second there, hit that like button, share this with your friends or family if you know that someone could use this, and subscribe to the channel.